In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Well, Mr. Scott Fuller, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Becca. Thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So you are a volunteer with FindJodi.com, but I was reading on the website that you began writing for newspapers at 13 years old.
That's right. Yep.
What was 13-year-old Scott Fuller writing about?
Sports. Back
Sports?
then. It was not true crime at that point, not missing people. When I grew up in a very small town in Colorado, my high school graduating class had like 24 kids in it. So at one point, we had a weekly, tiny, like 12-page weekly newspaper, and I faxed them. I sent them a fax and said, I'll write for you for free. And they said, no, we can't do that, but we'll pay you to write for us. So that was my job from 13 through college, to write for them and other outlets. And back then it was mostly sports.
Did you always want to be a journalist?
I specifically wanted to be a sports writer. I didn't think I had a memory of watching, like a lot of journalists do, the movie All the President's Men about Watergate with Robert Redford. And I thought, man, that'd be fun. But then I saw they had to call people and make phone calls. And I thought, well, I don't want to do that, which is funny now. So I'll just stick with sports. I did kind of always want to be a writer. I had a romantic notion about writing and reading guys like Mitch Albom, Tuesdays with Morrie in that book. It just seemed like a really cool profession. And that's what I did. Just took some twists and turns along the way that I didn't expect.
Yeah. And then how did you end up then getting into kind of like the true crime area?
I think that started when I was pretty young with Unsolved Mysteries and Robert Stack. Cases like D.B. Cooper and even Bigfoot and just the mysterious side of, what's the answer here? And eventually that morphed into, probably through shows like Forensic Files, like seeing how crimes are committed and then how the police solve them and what's involved with that. I found pretty fascinating. And it wasn't all at once, but it was a want to know an unsolved answer and not being satisfied with, well, the boyfriend must have done it, or who knows what happened. But I couldn't fill that gap like people like to do. With just some answer. I had to know, what did happen. And so that led to the dark side of true crime.
I feel like that is a lot of people who kind of consume true crime content. It's like that desire just to know these big questions. Like, how could someone do something like that? Or like, how can someone just vanish and there's no answers? It just seems so impossible. So I definitely get that. And then when did you start volunteering for FindJodi?
Only probably in 2020, I think right before COVID hit, is when I officially joined the team. And at that point, I'd been looking into Jodi's case for about 2 years. And I hadn't heard of Jodi until probably 2009, so well after she had disappeared, and kind of avoided it because it seemed too big. It seemed like too much of a task. And little old me, what am I going to do? And slowly, at one point, I produced a podcast series for the radio station I worked for in southern Minnesota at that time that was about Jodi. That was well received. And one thing leads to another. Somebody contacts you about this lead, and you kind of look into it. And before you know it, you're, knee deep in Jodi Huisentruit. And so I said, I may as well just dive in. And I found that my ability to research public information was helpful, and at that time my location, which was inside the same media market as Jodi worked in, was a benefit to the team too. So they brought me on 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm the new guy. FindJodi's been around since 2003 or 4.
Yeah. And who was it that founded FindJodi again?
It was Josh Benson and his news director, Gary Peterson, who worked at a competing station to Jodi's in the Austin, Rochester, Mason City market. They looked into Jodi's case, I think, is just a regular local news story at first. And the way Gary was, he was actually a certified death scene investigator, which he pursued more later in life after sort of he retired. So that combination of knowing how to process a crime scene initially and this news director side that Gary had, I think was an ultimate combination for putting together this website and trying to advance the investigation on the public side.
Absolutely. And there you guys have a really great podcast out, Find Jodi, the Find Jodi podcast. And I would encourage anyone who's listening to go binge that whole podcast. We there's no way we could ever get in near as much depth or in detail as you guys get in that podcast. It's amazing. I have more questions about the Find Jodi organization later on, but let's just dive into Jodi Huisentruit's case. So she was abducted from her apartment complex parking lot on June 27th, 1995. Can you describe who Jodi was at the time, around the time of her abduction?
Yeah, Jodi was a 27-year-old woman who had lived in Mason City and worked at KIMT for about a year and a half at the time that she was abducted. She was like a lot of people in some ways in that she was trying to find herself. She tried to be a flight attendant for a short period of time. I think she always wanted to be on television, especially after college. She went to college to study journalism and worked in 3 different markets, including Mason City, Alexandria, Minnesota, and then down in Iowa before moving up to Mason City, where she was the morning anchor for their daybreak show, which is kind of like a Good Morning Iowa kind of a show, which is what Jodi wanted to do. A lot of people, I think, get confused, easily so, that she's reporting on things that are happening in a community, and so she's an investigative reporter, but she wasn't. She was just not just, but her niche was to sit there behind the camera and make that connection with the audience. Because as viewers, we have this choice of, 3, 4 different channels at that time. How am I going to start my day and figure out what the weather is going to be in the local news? And one of the big factors is the anchor, and just sometimes an intangible thing, an X factor that an anchor has that, she's watchable. She, for whatever reason, she makes me feel like better than watching the other channels that are available to me. So I think she was honing that side of her media career at the time she disappeared. She also didn't want to stay. She was looking to move to a bigger market, which is what all people in media do at that age, especially, and probably somewhere warmer. I think she was ready to move. I think her buying that car that she bought that became so infamous was indicative of that, because it's not a Mason City, Iowa car, the bright red Mazda Miata convertible. So I think she was hoping for somewhere bigger and warmer, and soon, probably in the next 6 months, she probably would have moved on, but she never had that chance.
Mm-hmm. And she had, what was her group of friends like around that time?
That's an interesting question, because a lot of us just are pretty simple that way. We have maybe a very close group of husbands, wives, girlfriends, family. And then beyond that, there's a circle of friends that we have of varying degrees of closeness to us. Jodi had, I think, a lot of those different circles. So I think she had a work group of friends, and tangential to that, and she had an older group of business community friends. She probably had friends that we've never heard from. She was just a very popular, likable person. So when everybody sort of wants a piece of you, and Jodi, frankly, liked that attention, otherwise she wouldn't be doing what she was doing. She just collected people, I think, and she had all these disparate groups of friends everywhere that she went. And she also stayed in touch with old friends a lot better than most people do. She was writing letters, and so Jodi had people all over Minnesota. And by the time she disappeared, after only a year and a half in Mason City, she knew a lot of people there, and a lot of people knew her, which does not make her case any easier to look into now.
Yeah, I bet. And so the morning of her abduction, can you kind of walk us through what we know about that morning before she was reported missing?
That was a Tuesday. She had spent Monday at a charity golf tournament, a chamber golf tournament, which was kind of rained out. And so they spent the good part of Monday afternoon into the evening drinking and just socializing in the clubhouse. At some point on Monday afternoon, Jodi did go home to change clothes, and she went back from her apartment to the country club where the dinner was to be held. Had the dinner, um, was seen leaving at a specific time, and then the next morning at about 3:50, her producer Amy Coons called her to say, "Hey, you showing up for work or not?" Because at that point, Jodi was supposed to be there at least an hour before that. At 3 o'clock or so is her usual call time, is what they call it. She's not there. Amy gets her on the phone at about 3:50. Excuse me, 3:50. Jodi sounds, according to Amy, like she'd just been woken up, asking what time it is and saying, "Oh no, I'll be in shortly," basically. Hangs up the phone. Amy goes back to work at her desk. A good amount of time goes by. She calls back, and this time she gets no answer. And it's probably 4:10, 4:15, and their show starts at 5 o'clock that morning. So Jodi needs to be there. She never does arrive, and so Amy goes on air in her place. Following the broadcast, she has somebody at the station call MCPD, the Mason City Police Department. The first officer is there within just a couple of minutes of that call, shortly after 7 a.m., and they find signs of a struggle in the parking lot. Some of Jodi's belongings are strewn throughout the parking lot. They see her Mazda Miata still parked in its kind of usual place. Not noticeable aside from her items, and the mirror on the driver's side of her Miata is bent backwards, which looks strange, but Jodi's nowhere in sight. And so really the whole mystery starts from that moment in that parking lot. So we know of Jodi last being heard of through Amy Coons at 3:50. We think she was attacked in the parking lot as she left in a hurry toward her car at about 4:15, maybe 4:13, and the police didn't arrive for a couple hours after that. So there was a window for whoever did whatever they did to Jodi to have some distance between them and that parking lot.
And I think too, in listening to your guys' podcast, uh, that she had, maybe woken up late before, but she had never
Mhm.
just completely missed a day of work. There was no blood found at the scene, was
Hmm.
there?
Correct.
But there was a partial palm print.
They found a partial palm print somewhere on Jodi's car. Um, that could or maybe isn't related to her abductor. It could be somebody touching the car in the parking lot. It could be, say, the day before, someone brings her golf clubs out to her car for her, kind of walking her to her car, sticks the clubs in the trunk, shuts the trunk, palm print. So it is physical forensic evidence, but it's not definitively linked necessarily to whoever took Jodi. If the palm print belonged to a certain person who could explain it away, that's one thing, but it would be big evidence if they were to, among the people that they've investigated for this crime, who have no business being in the parking lot that morning. If it's their palm print, maybe that's a different story. But as far as we're aware, and one single hair that was found somewhere in the parking lot, those are the only two pieces of physical evidence that we know of for sure in Jodi's case.
Yeah, and that would be interesting because I could see, yeah, someone walking by, maybe just for some reason touching the car, or yeah, like you said, helping her with things in there. Same
Mm-hmm.
with the hair. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of ways that could just be, someone's random hair flying by and whatever. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Unfortunately, it's not, Jodi's blood mixed with a killer's.
yeah.
That's not here in this case.
And what was the inside of her apartment like?
It was a relatively small apartment, one bedroom. There's a bathroom, pretty small, typical single bedroom. It had a window and a balcony that overlooked the parking lot. And that becomes significant because you can see Jodi's window not just from the parking lot in its entirety, but also from the street on Kentucky Avenue. So Jodi was running late that morning, which becomes interesting in the event of someone sitting there waiting for her. Had they stalked her for any period of time, they might know that her usual routine was 3 o'clock in the morning, 3:15 maybe. And if they'd been watching her, and on this morning it's now 3:50 when they see the light go on, or maybe 3:55, that that I think could factor into profiling sort of who would have done this, because if time isn't a factor, let's wait for a situation where Jodi is more on routine. The later you wait in the morning, the more risky it is. And it's just adding one more element of risk that you don't necessarily have to if you're not in a hurry. Gary Peterson, who's since passed away, but one of his big questions over the years was, why did it have to happen then, on that day, that even though Jodi is off schedule, assuming this person knew this, why does it have to be on that Tuesday? Which isn't obviously an unanswered question, but I think one we should probably always keep in mind in Jodi's case.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And you guys on your podcast, you had Julia from the Consult podcast on to
Mm-hmm.
kind of talk about it. And in my head, I always picture that, at least I personally think that it was someone that had to have been targeting her. I just can't in my head picture someone just happened to be in the parking lot at that time and just happened to, abduct her. I don't know. But yeah, I think it's significant that if it was something that was planned and targeted, that they decided to sit and wait. And you wonder, like, what was their cutoff point where they were like, okay, this is too risky for me to carry through with this. I just think that's really interesting. I don't know. The inside of her apartment too, there was what was it? There was two wine glasses that were out.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? And then,
Yep.
and I don't know if there's, I've heard people maybe theorize that maybe she just had a glass of wine one night, glass of wine and then another night. Was there anything that you thought was significant about that?
They also found, it took years, but they recently confirmed beer cans in a 2020 episode. I think the lead investigator on the case does confirm, I think there may be photos of two beer cans, which had always kind of been rumored as well. But yeah, it would appear, it had the appearance of you had someone over kind of late the night before and you didn't want to deal with it until the morning kind of thing. But that's not definitive necessarily. There's no way to know who drank from what on what day. So, yeah, it's again one thing to keep in mind, that was there ever on that night someone inside the apartment that might have had something to do with Jodi's disappearance? People point to the toilet seat that was found in the up position, according to police. We talked extensively, probably more than you ever imagined you'd hear about a toilet seat in one of the podcast episodes, about all the possibilities for that. It could be a visitor. It could be Jodi had cleaned the toilet. It could be she'd been sick. It could be MCPD used the facilities as they were processing the scene, which sounds crazy, but does happen sometimes. So all of this, I think you always have to keep things in mind in Jodi's case all at once, but you get in trouble if you take one of these little factoids in her case and say, this is true, this is gospel, and I'm going with this. That's where people come up with theories that they just don't move themselves from. And we have to avoid that. But yeah, there are all these possible inclusions of information or evidence in Jodi's case that might be the answer or have something to do with it. They could be totally coincidental too.
Yeah. I feel like there's always in these cases little things that, could just be nothing at all, but people, theorize and want to make it this big thing. I think about like the state of my own house right now. Like if something were to happen to me, people would be, debating forever about all these random things when it's just like, maybe I'm just messy or something,
Right.
And so what was the initial investigation like after they kind of figured that something had happened to her?
The first thing they did is they basically got a bolo out, like, this woman's missing. There was not a presumption right away that anything bad necessarily had happened to her, except for the sign of a struggle in the parking lot. If she's disappearing on her own, she's probably not going to strew all her items over the parking lot. So that was strange. So yeah, something's up, but we have no indication that any harm has come to her necessarily yet. So it's kind of a live person search at that point, emanating from the parking lot of the Key Apartments. And that's what continues over the first 2 or 3 days, especially. They bring in dogs from different parts of the state. They roam those dogs down by the river. There was some interest, and which is right behind her apartment complex. In the parking lot across the street of Kentucky, they also searched what is now pretty developed, but back then was wide open land. They never find, and nowhere ever has any evidence that we know of Jodi's been found outside of the parking lot. There's no driver's license that's found somewhere. Her date book we know is missing. The shoes or the outfit that she was wearing that day have not been found, and maybe the shoes, because there are shoes found in the parking lot. But it's not uncommon for news anchors to stick a pair of dress shoes in a carry-on bag, kind of a go bag, and maybe those were the shoes that were found and not the shoes that were on her feet, which are still missing. So things like that, we honestly don't know what she was wearing that day. Jodi was a big accessorizer. She had lots of jewelry constantly, but to our knowledge, nothing has been found outside of the parking lot. And that live person search in the first couple of days obviously didn't find anything either.
And what do they know about? So I know that you mentioned the day before she was at like a golf tournament. What was she doing that night after the golf tournament?
So that's kind of a black hole a little bit. A friend of hers named John Van Sice claims that she came to his apartment, his duplex really, to watch a video of a birthday party that he had helped to throw for her at a local bar about 3 weeks before she disappeared. Apparently, he was very excited to show her this. By John Van Sice's account, she was there for about, the length of time it would take to watch the video and maybe a little bit longer, and then went home. He told this to the police, and they then went and got her landline phone records that shows that Jodi made a physical phone call from her apartment at a certain time, which pretty well contradicted the time that John Van Sice had said the night before. It would have been difficult, if not impossible, for that story to be on the money true of John's timeline-wise and her making the phone call. Again, could be notable, definitely understandable why he becomes a person to look at right away based on that. But he's also, if he's off in his telling of the story by 20 minutes or half an hour, it becomes entirely viable for her to have done all these things. So he's on camera to local news telling the same story a couple of days later, and maybe it's suspicious, definitely worth looking into. But all it would take is him being, ballparking a timeline of being off by 20 or 30 minutes, and then she could have done that. There are people that think she was never there at all. If people who think that John Van Sice is involved, think that that's a story that he concocted for some reason. That never really made sense to me. Why would you, if you'd done something to her, why would you put her in your townhouse?
Right.
But definitely stranger things have happened too. So that's why John Van Sice, it's fair to say, becomes the first big suspect in the investigation.
Yeah. And what, anytime you look up Jodi's case, John Van Sice's name is like one of the first things that pops up. Can you talk about just what police have kind of done in terms of like looking into him over the years?
I don't know much of it. I know they've interviewed him. They definitely interviewed him right away. I've talked to the people who were with him as he was brought down to the police station on that day. He says he was polygraphed. He says he passed it. I believe he was polygraphed. They polygraphed a lot of people in Jodi's case. We've just run into them accidentally. They've never confirmed whether or not he passed it. As of, not that long ago, as of 2015, they're still looking into him enough where he's now living in Arizona, but they take out search warrants on 2 of his vehicles, which were not even manufactured in 1995. And they summon him for a grand jury for physical evidence. They subpoena him to come back to Iowa, basically. And the theory is that they thought that while he was giving his hair and his DNA, he might take his new vehicle to a place that was relevant to something that might have happened to Jodi, if that makes sense. The police have never said that. That's, I think, the most logical assumption of what their game plan was at that time. So from 1995 to 2015, they're still interested in John Van Sice, but I know they've looked into other people over the years as well. He's just kind of always been there, someone that they liked from the beginning and never were able to rule out.
Do you think that's because of maybe the age difference between them? I feel like that's always focused on a lot, is people wondering if he wanted something more from her. And I always kind of like felt like it was because he was, I wouldn't say maybe quite a bit older, but he was a little bit
He was
older
quite a
than,
bit older. Yeah, he
yeah.
was he was 20 years, I think, older
Okay. Yeah.
than she was. Yeah, so yeah, I've talked to a lot of the same people I imagine police have talked to about John Van Sice, and I think there are other things too. His temper comes up a little bit. Um, Possessiveness comes up a little bit. Jodi and he were never in a relationship that we know of. They may have discussed it, or it may have been proposed by one or the other. Maybe John approached her about it, and maybe she said no. That's all speculation. So I think there's enough there to look where you usually look, which is people who have that romantic connection with the victim. 99% of the time, basically that's where you look. So that's understandable, I think. And if you're never able to definitively rule him out, and if you have witnesses who are saying, not to the crime, but witnesses to their relationship who, in hindsight of something bad happening to Jodi, might be picking out some of the worst attributes and worst interactions they ever had, I understand why you still continue to look at him.
Yeah. Do you know if Jodi was seeing anyone at that time? I was under the impression she had not really, or it wasn't known for sure if she had been dating anybody. I just happened to see, uh I don't know how reputable this article is, but it was just published on the 16th, November 16th, and a private investigator had said, he says that jealousy over a newly discovered secret relationship may have led to her disappearance. Sounds not legit to me, but I don't know what you know about that.
I mean, it could be. Yeah,
Yeah.
Steve Ridge is the PI
Yeah.
you're mentioning, and he comes out with info. He's been looking into Jodi's case for a while, and he comes out with information that is frustrating because he gives half of his conclusion and none of the supporting. Here's how I got there.
Mm,
Um, it's his prerogative to do. I would never do that unless I were able to fully lay out, the information, which I probably wouldn't be able to do. So I probably wouldn't go public with that particular bit of information. But to answer your question, that's a hard one because Jodi liked men. Jodi was not interested in a long term romantic relationship, I think it's fair to say. But she did have that interest eventually. Some of her diary, and a strange twist in this case, is leaked to the local newspaper. And she does express not a loneliness, but an eventually I'd like to complete my life in this way once I get myself kind of settled down. In the meantime, I know she had relationships, kind of shorter relationships. I don't know how many. I don't know how frequent or recent to her disappearance, because she had all these different circles of friends, and she was a pretty private person, and she was friendly and knew a lot of people. So I don't think anyone knows. We're aware of the relationship that Steve Ridge is referencing. Its significance, I think, might be in question to her disappearance. But we don't know. I mean, that's the whole thing. Is we can't even say that because we obviously don't know the end answer in the case.
yeah, absolutely. One thing I thought was that seems significant, and again, maybe it's not, but um, just a bit before her disappearance, wasn't it she had told her mother or someone that she felt like someone had been following her?
She did tell, yeah, Joanne, her sister, one of her sisters, later tells the story that she had expressed to the family that she felt a little bit uncomfortable, but I think she expressed that to others more because I don't think she wanted to worry necessarily her family who was living in a different state. But she was concerned enough about something where she took a self defense class months before, 6, 7 months before she disappeared. Only took the one class, was actually late for that class, and just picked up a couple of notes and left them for one of her coworkers, who I guess she'd had a previous conversation about all this with. Important to keep in mind that women in news receive a lot of inevitable harassment, for want of a better term. And usually it's pretty innocuous in today's day and age of Facebook and email. But if you're reaching, say, 500,000 people in that market, and your job is to make a connection through the screen with the audience, there's always a certain small percentage of twisted minds that will take that and see it for something that it is not. So every woman who's in television has to deal with it. I've never met one who doesn't have that kind of a story. It's very rare, though, that what happened to Jodi is the end result. To be physically abducted and from a parking lot is a very rare crime. Um, so I went off on a tangent there. I think I forgot your initial question, but it was it, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, you're fine. No, I think that is a good point though, and because I think nowadays, you know, journalists and people in the media, they're somewhat more accessible in a way because of social media, but I feel like
Mhm.
their personal lives can also be a little more anonymous. Whereas with Jodi, I mean, her phone number and address were in the phone
Yeah,
book. So I feel
yeah,
like if someone was determined enough and, you know, had somewhat of an obsession, it would be much easier to find her personally than I think maybe it would be nowadays. Uh, whereas now, you know, you can just kind of online, you know, stalk someone, but physically
right.
showing up, I think is something that's like less, uh, like you'd be less able to do nowadays. Um, okay, so we talked about some of the stuff strewn about in the parking lot. There was also mention of a van in the parking lot and like some beer bottles in the parking lot. Those to me, I'm not sure if they're very significant, but would you be able to touch on those?
Definitely could be significant. One of the initial sightings was witness sightings was from a man named Randy Linderman who was driving to work, carpooling to pick up a coworker to go to Winnebago, south of Mason City, that morning, and he says he saw a white Winnebago van. Ford Econoline van that is parked facing Kentucky in Jodi's parking lot with its running lights on, with its parking lights on. He always claims that he saw it. He works for Winnebago, so he knows his vehicles. He's like, no, that's a Ford Econoline van. I know what it is. And he took note of it because he thought it was a cop that was sitting on Kentucky looking for speeders or whatever else. So he later that day contacted the police. We since learned there were other vehicle sightings made by other people in the area. One was of a truck, and that was sort of presented to Jack Schliepert, who was the Mason City police chief at the time, and he definitely prioritized the van over the truck. He took Randy Linderman's witness sighting as more credible because he was more awake than the other witness across the street who had kind of rolled over and gotten up and looked out the window and claimed to have seen the truck. So it's the van that they went wide with right away, and that's the vehicle that was and has always will be associated with Jodi's case. Very well could be related to her abduction, but it also may be entirely unrelated. And they never found that van.
Yeah, and because you start to wonder if someone came up and grabbed her, uh, I mean, I don't know. I think they would have had to have had a
Mhm.
vehicle close by because, I mean, how risky would that be to try to like literally, you know, pull her a distance away? So it could make sense that the van was related. But yeah, again, it's like all of these things where it could be the thing or it could just be a random van that just happened to be there. Um,
The beer cans are seen in. There's two parking lots to the Key Apartments. There were beer cans seen in both of them kind of around the time of the abduction. This gets a little hinky for me because we're asking people to recollect seeing beer cans 30 years ago. So I'm not sure how much credence I put in it, but um, supposedly there are beer cans lined up along one of the parking, concrete pillars in the parking lot at some period of time before Jodi went missing. What's intriguing about that, obviously, is if you're sitting there watching Jodi, it might be related to what happened to her. And apparently, after that, the beer cans were gone. But the beer cans get mentioned a lot because we now know there were two beer cans in Jodi's apartment. There are beer cans that were seen in parking lot kind of A right next to hers. And then across from the two long buildings, there were also beer cans seen there at some point, and all of them were noted and kind of mentioned to the management at that time, which is how we heard about them.
hmm. When so there's the initial investigation. At what point do you think, or maybe you don't know, I'm not sure, at what point does it start to kind of become apparent that there's just like really no information or no leads? Like when does it become considered like a cold case?
I think just I don't know that information, but and I'm not sure that they would even call it cold today.
Mm-hmm.
Some detectives get finicky about that word, but I would say, just judging from the media coverage, after about 2 months, it was starting to look pretty bad. I think they had run out their primary first lead was John Van Cise, but at the same time they were going all over the Midwest to interview people because when something like this happens, um, the stories come out of the woodwork of how many bad people are in any given town, and then once we don't have answers after say a year or 2 years, the local rumor mill starts to kind of fill in. I've heard 1,000 times she is buried under the hospital nearby because it was under construction at that point. That she was fed to pigs on a pig farm is another prominent one. The Dustin Honkin story gets told a lot because of he was a bad dude, killed people in the drug business, and the timeline just so happened to be right around Jodi. And so anything bad that's happening in Mason City from 95 to or 94 through 97, hey, maybe that was related to what happened to Jodi, and it just becomes entrenched in local rumor, and you can't necessarily rule any of it out. I've followed some really wild rabbits down rabbit holes in this case, but those are the local rumors in Jodi's case, that she's under the hospital, that she is was fed to pigs, that she's at the bottom of an oil well somewhere or something. But not unusual though in cases like this. There's the rumor that gets told and retold, and that becomes kind of good enough for people to pacify their curiosity.
Yeah, I'm from Iowa originally, and so I've, anytime missing persons in Iowa come up, or there's, any sort of like crime story, the one thing I always hear is something about them being fed to pigs. And I'm like, why is that
Mm-hmm.
always the go-to? It's just crazy. um, I don't know. Sometimes I think people just go off the deep end with some theories sometimes. Around the time of Jodi's disappearance, was there anything similar that had happened in the area, or was this like an outlier?
How do you define similar? So there were definitely women who had gone missing in Cerro Gordo County over the last 3, 4, 5 years. But how do you match anyone to Jodi's profile? Because I think you have to factor in that she was on television. I think it widens the suspect pool. So if her vocation is part of her profile, then no. But if we narrow it down to just people being abducted or taken from public places, there are a few more. There's actually a woman uh, weeks after who is abducted from the parking lot of a Mason City bar by two men who were eventually arrested for it, turned on each other, and went to prison. So yeah, you could say parking lot, public place, time of the day. That's similar. Do you include who Jodi was? Does her being in television in her victimology, is that relevant? And if it is, then I don't think any other similar cases help. But um, I know statistically the odds of this just being this man committed this one crime, that's all he ever did, I think that's unlikely too. So over the years, we found some interesting escalations of certain people that we've looked into, from window peeping, something along those lines, which I think is more kind of elevative to abducting somebody. But there are no similar. Unfortunately, there's no person who stole a news anchor from Des Moines 2 weeks later who was caught. There's nothing like that.
Wow. Um, Aside from John Van Cise, what were some of the other major, maybe, people that they were looking into? Or do they not? I guess maybe they don't name them publicly.
I never like to, but
Yeah.
this case is different. They're all out there anyway. The police ruled out Tony Jackson, who was a serial rapist in Minnesota, who it turned out was living in Mason City at the time that Jodi went missing. Um, and Caroline Lowe, who's on our team, worked for a TV station in the metro in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and did a lot of work on that. So much, I think, that they had to take it seriously when it was reported on. And they went down to a silo in Tiffin, Iowa, and found some evidence of something that they later determined to be not human DNA material. And they looked into, as best they could, the mileage that was put on a car that he had access to. They eventually ruled him out, and I think he may be the only suspect that was formally publicly ruled out in Jodi's case. Team members had questions about him to this day, just like we do everybody. Thomas Corskadden is someone who was a sex offender in Austin who was looked at, we know, publicly for the crime. There have been dozens and dozens of people that were looked at by the police that we've just never heard about publicly. There would have to have been, because we've looked at hundreds of names over the years. So I would imagine that a lot of people were looked at. But at the end of the day, they have to be there. And it's really hard to put someone in that parking lot before widespread cell phone use, before this closed circuit world that we live in now, where there's a camera on every street corner and every doorbell. And this person had a 2.5, 3 hour head start. So putting whoever it is in Mason City isn't good enough, because we've got dozens of those. It's, what's their connection to Jodi, and how could they be in the parking lot on that morning? That's tough.
Yeah. So just recently on November 1st, Caroline Lowe had posted on the FindJodi website about one of the more recent updates in the case. Can you talk about that? That was like a search of a property in Minnesota.
Yeah, we got, this is all very recent. About a month ago, I want to say, maybe more, we got an anonymous email, and all the email was a link to a newspaper article to the local paper there in Winstead, Minnesota. And it didn't mention Jodi. It said that local police are assisting an Iowa agency in a case, and that's all it said. So we have extensive files of research and information that we've collected over the years. And I ran it through, all I did was run Winstead through our system. And we have one lead, sort of one investigative avenue, and one only from over the years, which I won't necessarily go into here. But it was enough for me to call down to the Mason City Police Department, the investigator there, and say, not sure if you're aware of this, but we have Winstead, we have this connection. Not sure if you guys do or not. Investigator at that time was on vacation. By the time he'd gotten back to me, we had confirmed through the local chief in Winstead that this was a Jodi Huisentruit related investigation, a long way away in central Minnesota. So that's the initial story that we posted, that this was Jodi related, once we got it confirmed. And then they have since followed up and said whatever they were looking for, basically nothing was found except for animal bones, which is not unusual in that area. And that's, to my knowledge, as far as it's gone. I do not know specifically what new information would have brought them. We obviously know what old information we had, but what made it so important for them to start digging in a certain place? What were they looking for? Did they find anything related to Jodi that made them, there are items missing that aren't necessarily Jodi's remains. So all of that, I don't know. But it was interesting that they were looking that far away, and it was specific for Jodi.
Yeah, definitely. What is your guys' relationship like with law enforcement? I mean, I imagine with these cases, they can't really reveal a whole lot, but do you guys are you able to collaborate a lot, or is there not really a whole lot of communication?
No, collaborate's not the word. It's one way. It's us providing them information. I've done several of these, and everyone's different. Every agency and every investigator is different. Some will sit there with you, grab the file, open it, and have a conversation. And that's not the way MCPD has ever, recently treated Jodi's case. But if I find something that I can only take so far, I will give it to MCPD, and it's a one-way street. That's where it's at lately. But I'm fine with that, because I'm not going to solve the case. I'm certainly not going to prosecute the case. That has to be done the right way. So if anything that I find, or if anybody I talk to gives me information that I think is going to help, then I pass it on. And over the years, I have given them stuff that they didn't have. And that's just has to be good enough, that's fine with me. There's plenty of stuff that we've given to police and that we've uncovered that we've never published, and that's
Yeah.
kind of just the way that we operate.
And I think that's good too. I think a lot of people who dive into these cases just to like consume the content get frustrated because there's not all these
Mhm.
updates being released and they don't have all the information. And I don't think people realize like how harmful that can be and how, a lot of, because I mean, there's like a strategy, I think, with police departments and investigators on what information they'll release. And you think of other cases that get big, and this isn't, an equal comparison, but you think of like the John Benet Ramsey case. It's like so much has been released, and that case has gotten
Mhm.
so big that you wonder, even if they were to find someone connected with her murder, like how has like the evolution of the media and how big that case has gotten, like how does that impact the ability to prosecute someone? I just can imagine it makes it extremely difficult. So I think sometimes people forget that like it's not, these cases aren't just for consumption for entertainment purposes. Like
Right.
you're not going to get all the information out there. Um, has there Okay, so there was that recent update with the tip in Minnesota. Have there been many updates like that over the years?
There definitely have been over the years. Not recently, though. It's been pretty quiet over the last 2, 3 years. We get tips, and the good tips are attached to information that we can at least start to look into. But a lot of tips are just, I've always heard that she is here, and it's not a specific place. Or, we encourage everyone to give us all the information that they can, because you never know what we have or what police have that is the missing piece of the puzzle. But it's tough to get specifics when you're talking about 30 years ago using public information. The police can do a little bit better with vehicles and things like that, but it's been really slow. And a site search that is Jodi specific, this would be the first in several years. Yeah.
Hmm. When you get tips like that, do you get your hopes up at all, or are you able to kind of like just go with the flow with the information? I feel like I would be like so excited with
I
every.
think I have thought this has been solved 4 or 5 times. Yeah. And this most recent one in Winstead was another. It just felt, I've since come around to thinking it's probably not going to be the answer, but at first it was, in a reverse way, it kind of made a bunch of sense. Like, of course, that's why no one's found her, is because she's been so far away for this entire time in this specific location where it does make physical sense that it would be difficult to find her remains there. And it goes back to something that is already in our files, which I've always thought that we do have the name in our files. It's just proving it and finding that last connection. And the police said it was Jodi specific. That was, I think, a big statement for them to make. Um, but that's about as excited as I got, and then it just exploded. I couldn't believe the media coverage that got, and I almost wanted to say, "Wait a minute, this is what we know, and that's all we know."
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. Like, you guys are taking this way too far. But who knows? I know that angle of the investigation is still ongoing. They're interviewing people around that, and they're who knows what they found or didn't find. But yeah, no, I do. I get pretty excited about, this has got to be it. But so far it hasn't been.
And you just, I've been hearing on the news lately, I feel like the last couple of years there have been so many cold cases like from so long ago that are starting to be solved, and more information is coming out, so it seems so promising that like one of these days we just have to get answers. And so I can't imagine, especially with you and the other FindJodi members that have dedicated so much time to it, like how
Hmm.
you deal with these new, updates coming out. And I feel like I would get my hopes up over everything, and then it would just be so disappointing if it doesn't come to be. But moving on to the FindJodi organization, so what are the main goals of FindJodi?
Just to keep her name out there, just
Mm-hmm.
to advocate for the fact that she's still missing.
Yeah.
We have some skills in, again, researching and interviewing, and we're all journalists by trade, so we can apply those to try to get more information than we would normally. But um, beyond that, like I said, we're wanting to. I would love nothing more than for somebody else to step forward and say, "Here's the answer," And if FindJodi doesn't get the credit for it, and if I never have to be on TV again from this case, I'd be more than okay with that. Um, we just want to be kind of like the symbolic billboard that's an actual billboard in Mason City. That's what we want to be, as a lighthouse for Jodi's case, saying, hey, world keeps spinning, but she's still missing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How many people right now volunteer with FindJodi?
So we recently lost one of our team members. J.L. Barrio passed away just a couple of weeks ago. And so it is myself and Josh Benson, who's a news anchor in Florida, his wife, and Caroline Lowe is out in California. I've since moved a couple of years ago to Wyoming. So we're all over the country collaborating, but especially in the recent couple of months, we'll email and text every day. And I try to set aside an hour or so a day to, if I have something to look into Jodi wise, to look into it and try to cap myself, because once I start, I have a hard time stopping. But yeah, it's when something comes in, we're here to receive it and look into it as much as we can and help out as much as we can. Not trying to get in the way of the formal investigation, but to sometimes in a happy way and sometimes maybe in an annoying way. It's like, hey, Jodi's still missing. What's going on? That's kind of our function.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, I think even just keeping these cases out there is so important because, I mean, if people stop talking about it, of course, everyone's going to, just move on. And you never know
Mm-hmm.
who out there might have that one bit of information or hear something so I think that's so important. What, this might be kind of like a boring logistical question, but how do you guys like divide the work? Do you guys have like one certain, certain areas you focus on, or is it kind of like leads come in and then you just like divvy out who does it?
Yeah, kind of that. Leads will come in, and the first to claim it kind of gets to, just so we're not doubling up on work and we're not crossing over efforts and confusing people. If one comes in that I think I have a good shot at for whatever reason, I'll say I got this one. Caroline will do the same thing. We also, one of my favorite things to do is to just kind of go back through the files to maybe a random place and fish back, suss out that lead again, even if I've done it before, because I've gotten better at it over the years. So maybe I'll approach something different. And maybe I'll see something different because the day I looked at it the first time, I was distracted by my children running around the house or something. Going back through old stuff, I think, is pretty productive to when we have nothing new to look into. Because otherwise, I found that just time goes by. If I don't pick up the file, 3 months has gone by and I've done no Jodi research. And I don't know if me, anyone else on the team, or anyone else in the world is going to be able to solve this case or find that missing piece. But I do know it's not going to happen if no one's trying to.
Yeah, absolutely. And you all like volunteer. This is all like on a
Yep.
volunteer basis, correct?
Yeah, we're a nonprofit. We've never been compensated for any work that we do for FindJodi. As a matter of fact, we're due for a fundraising push for the billboards and things like that, because that, I think, is important to keep up in Mason City. One of the things that Julia Callie said that you referenced when she was with us is she thinks, if she had to guess, as a former FBI profiler, she thinks that the guy's still there and has been there the whole time, which is possible. And if nothing else, Jodi should be present in Mason City to say, I'm still missing and you did this to me, is kind of the attitude I have about it. I think it doesn't hurt anything to have the billboard there, and that's where most of our funds from fundraising have gone to over the last couple of years, is to keep at least one of those billboards up in Mason City.
I definitely think that what Julie had said was something that stuck with me. And I don't know if this is maybe dependent on certain offenders' personalities, but I know I've read that some, recommend keeping stuff like this out in the news because, I mean, you never know how that person changes over the years. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
at some point they, can't live with the weight of what they've done and maybe they come forward, or maybe they, start to feel it. They see her out in the news and maybe they tell someone or let something slip. So I think it's really important, not only for generating tips and just keeping her name out there, but if this person's still out there, which like she said, I mean, um, age wise, you'd think, he probably still is.
Well, if he was
Uh,
Jodi's age, he would be late 50s. So, yeah,
yeah.
definitely could be.
So you said that was going to be one of my other questions. Was I know that on your website you guys accept donations and everything, and so that money goes towards the billboards to
Hmm.
kind of keep her name out there. Um, for just the organization, is there how can people help find Jodi, the organization, and then her case in general?
I think learn as much as you can about it. And if you really want to, the podcast does a good job of going as deep as we can with what we can report about what we've done. But the idea with the podcast was there's a lot of misinformation about Jodi's case out there. There's a lot of rumor. We tried to present that as here are the known puzzle pieces that you have to work with if you want to look into Jodi's case. And the reason I think that's important is beyond the entertainment value that you mentioned, try to take advantage of that because this person is related to somebody who has now a niece who's listening to a true crime podcast. It's almost a certainty. So get as much out there as you can, hoping that when someone finds an earring in an attic or finds an uncle's diary entries from 20 years ago and JODI is mentioned over and over again, or just to have the top of mind presence for everybody, as many people as we can in Jodi's case, so that if that day comes where a connection could be made, then they can make the connection and say something. And it could take something as small as that to start the ball rolling. But if you're 40 and older ish from Iowa, you know about Jodi Huisentruit, maybe a little bit younger. But the younger generation um, doesn't. And a lot of people not from Iowa are unaware of Jodi's case. So that's what FindJodi, the website and the podcast is for, is to here's what we know about the case. Please be aware of it and please keep an eye open and an ear open for anything in your life. You never know.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If she was abducted in 1995,
Mm-hmm.
I would have been 3 years old. And so
Mm-hmm.
you think of all the people now growing up that are jumping into true crime. I mean, it's like a
Yeah.
massive genre. Like you said, there might be someone out there that all of a sudden they know something and, just from like a family member or someone they've met. So I think that's so important. Is there anything else you want to add about Jodi's case that you think listeners should be aware of or something that we didn't touch on?
Any profiler would tell you, pay attention to the anniversaries. June 27th is when Jodi was abducted. There's often behavior changes around the time of an anniversary. If you have a relative, I've said this more in recent years, if you have anyone who was in Mason City or the area in 95, ask them if they know about Jodi because chances are they will. People may or may not like to talk about true crime as openly as maybe you and I do, but ask the question because it was kind of like it was almost like a JFK moment there, where I've had so many people tell me, I remember exactly where I was when I heard that Jodi had been taken. And it's worth asking the question because if they know something, that's the very first thing I've found that people say. So, oh yeah, I remember that. Definitely, here's where I was. They always said that this is what happened. The story of what they've heard is what follows next, and you never know what that's going to be. So, um, bring it up to people who are alive, especially if they were 20s and 30s in 1995. And I'm not trying to say anyone's uncle killed anybody, but people talking is what's going to solve this case since there's apparently no DNA that we know of in her case, which is how these 50-year-old cold cases are being solved. It's going to take someone confessing and then police being able to ask the right questions and corroborate that confession. And only then maybe we'll find Jodi, and it's going to be a tough case to prosecute anyway. But goal number one is to, while Joanne, her sister, and the rest of her family are still around, to get her the answer of what happened to Jodi. And what happens then, you know, is it a plea bargain? Is it a full trial? Is it they're never found, but Jodi's remains are found? Who knows? But finding Jodi would be great. So
Yeah.
be aware of the case, and we thank you and everyone that provides coverage for Jodi's case, because you never know who's going to see something or hear something that trips a memory or leads to something.
Absolutely. And I will link in the description of this, your guys' website. I will link to your podcast, which is fantastic. You guys should bring it back. It was so good. Do an update episode.
I mean, there's a lot that I would love to tell, but we just can't.
Yeah.
It's not ethical to report some of the things, the names, the people, the places, the information that we have, but it's wild. And someday, maybe somehow, it'll all come out. But that podcast could be so much better if we were allowed to say what we could say. But as it is, it's as deep dive as you want to go in Jodi's case. I fair to say you're not going to find any more details or more thorough. I think we have like 30 episodes, so there's plenty there.
Everything's there. I feel like it can answer seriously every question. So I hope anyone that happens to see this immediately goes to your podcast to listen to it all. Well, okay, Scott, I want to thank you so much for being here. I had such a great time talking about this. I really hope that we get answers to this case soon. It's one of the ones I know there are so many people out there that are just hoping that one day it's solved.
Yeah, me too. So I can move on to the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other cases that you kind of look into that you'd love to deep dive into?
There are, like there's a runner that went missing out here in Wyoming. Amy Robechtel is the very first case I ever did investigatively, like on the ground, talking to law enforcement and family members and witnesses and things like that. That one still hasn't been solved. That was 97. But that's what got me started with a podcast called Frozen Truth. I did Amy's case and a few others, including Jodi's, and that led to my involvement in FindJodi. But those are kind of my two big ones, just because I've talked to the cops, I've talked to the family, I've become invested in that way. They're both kind of equally mysterious in different ways. But yeah, there are a couple others, and I'm not sure how I'd feel when Jodi's case is solved. Some of it would be, all right, what do I do now? Mission accomplished. But when that day comes, I'm sure, as long as I can help do something for somebody somewhere, I'll keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of why I wanted to start this podcast as well. There's a cold case in Iowa, Dawn Allen. She's been missing since 2011, and it's kind of it's similar to Jodi, where it's like police suspect foul play, but there's like nothing to go off of. She just vanished. And that's one that I would really, if I'm ever able to live back in Iowa, I would love to like actually go and like talk to people about it and stuff like that. But there's so many. But okay, well, thank you so much, Scott, for being here.
Thanks, Becca. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself.